I paid
Good morning. This is the midday
$80,000
news brief.
to
In
give
our
my
top story,
son the
City
lavish
Council
wedding
approved the
he
controversial
begged for
budget plan
believing
late last
I was
night after
securing
hours of
our
debate.
family legacy.
Good evening. In today's
Then the
headlines,
wedding
the City
photographer
Council
called
approved the
me at
controversial
dawn
budget plan
and
late
whispered
last
that
night,
I needed to
despite
come
strong
to her
opposition
studio
from community
immediately.
groups. We begin
She
tonight
said
with
she
breaking
found a
news from the
secret
Capitol,
buried
where
in the
officials have just
background
announced
of a photograph.
significant policy shift
A
regarding
secret
the ongoing
that
trade
proved my own
negotiations.
flesh and
This is
blood had turned
WNYC
my
News,
home
developing
into a
story
crime
this
scene.
afternoon as the City
Tuesday
Council approved the
mornings are
controversial
usually my
rezoning plan
sanctuary.
despite vocal protests
The
from
house is
community
completely
groups.
still. I sit at the kitchen island, drink my black coffee, and watch the sun rise over the backyard. I am 68 years old. For 40 years, I worked as a regional logistics director for a major national freight carrier. My entire professional life was built on verifying inventory, managing complex supply chains, and ensuring that nothing went missing without a paper trail. I was a man who trusted spreadsheets and locked doors. I never imagined I would need to apply that same rigorous auditing to my own family. My phone buzzed aggressively against the cold granite countertop, shattering the morning silence. I glanced at the screen. The caller ID displayed Jess Miller Photography. Jess was the young, bright-eyed woman we had hired to shoot Harrison and Chloe's wedding just 2 weeks prior. I assumed she was calling about the final album layouts, or perhaps a billing question. I swiped to answer and put the phone to my ear, expecting a cheerful greeting. Instead, I heard a jagged, terrified breath. Jess sounded like she had been crying. She asked if this was Tom Barrett. I told her it was. Then she dropped her voice to a frantic whisper. She told me to get in my vehicle and drive to her downtown studio immediately. She specifically instructed me not to call Harrison. She warned me absolutely not to tell Chloe. When I asked her what was going on, her voice completely broke. She explained that she was up all night editing the high-resolution raw images from the rehearsal dinner. The dinner we had hosted right here in my house. She said she spotted something deeply disturbing in the deep background of a candid shot. Something she said I needed to witness with my own 2 eyes before she took the files to the local police department. I did not ask any more questions. I hung up the phone, grabbed my keys, and walked out to my truck. The drive from my quiet suburban neighborhood to the downtown arts district takes roughly 45 minutes in heavy morning traffic. Every single mile of that commute felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. My mind relentlessly circled back to the money. $80,000. It is a staggering amount of cash to burn on a single weekend. That money was not just a number on a bank screen. It represented decades of sacrifice. It was money my late wife Sarah and I had meticulously saved over our 40-year marriage. Sarah was a dedicated middle school teacher. I worked grueling 60-hour weeks managing freight hubs in freezing winters and boiling summers. We skipped vacations. We drove old cars. We built that nest egg for our retirement. We planned to buy a small, quiet cabin on the lake. But life is exceptionally cruel. Sarah passed away 3 years ago from an aggressive form of breast cancer. When she took her last breath, a massive piece of my soul died right there in the hospice room with her. I was left completely alone in a house that suddenly felt like a museum of ghosts. So when our only son Harrison came to me 6 months ago begging for financial help with his wedding, I caved. Harrison told me that Chloe came from a prominent family. He said she had expensive taste and expected a grand event. A prestigious country club reception. A 12-piece live band. Hundreds of imported floral arrangements. I was deeply reluctant to spend Sarah's hard-earned money on a glorified party. But Harrison knew exactly which emotional buttons to push. He sat right at my kitchen table, looked me in the eyes, and said, Mom would have wanted him to have the perfect start to his marriage. He claimed a beautiful wedding would honor her memory and bring joy back into our grieving family. I wanted to see my son happy. I wanted to believe I was building a solid foundation for my future grandchildren. So I wrote the checks. I liquidated a massive chunk of my savings. I convinced myself I was doing the right thing. As I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turned pale white. I thought back to the night of the rehearsal dinner. To save a few $1,000s on venue rentals, I agreed to host it at my house. It was a massive mistake. 50 people were packed into my home, spilling out of the living room and onto the back patio. It was loud and chaotic. I remembered feeling profoundly exhausted. My social battery drained quickly without Sarah by my side to host. I remembered retreating to my upstairs bedroom early while the party was still raging downstairs. What could Jess have possibly captured on her camera while I was asleep? I began to think about Chloe. My new daughter-in-law was always perfectly polite to my face, but there was a distinct coldness behind her eyes. She never asked about Sarah. She never showed interest in our family history. And then there was her brother Trent. Trent had flown in from Nevada a week before the wedding. He introduced himself as an independent real estate developer, but his behavior at the rehearsal dinner was incredibly strange. While everyone else was drinking wine and laughing, Trent cornered me in the kitchen. He asked me oddly specific questions about my property taxes, my insurance policies, and the layout of my home security system. At the time, I brushed it off as awkward, socially inept small talk from a guy who only knew how to talk about real estate. Now, as I navigated the gridlocked highway, a cold, sickening knot formed in the pit of my stomach. The puzzle pieces were shifting in my mind, forming an ugly picture I was terrified to look at. I am a man who relies on facts, on shipping manifests, on predictable outcomes. But as I pulled my truck up to the old brick building, where Jess rented her photography studio, I knew my safe, predictable life was about to violently shatter. I parked at a broken meter and hurried up the rusted metal stairs to the second floor. Jess opened her studio door before I even had the chance to knock. She looked terrible. She was pale, trembling, and had dark, heavy circles under her eyes. She looked like someone who had just witnessed a terrible car accident. She grabbed my arm, pulled me inside, and immediately threw the heavy brass deadbolt, locking us in. The studio was completely silent. The blinds were drawn, blocking out the morning sun. The only light in the room came from the harsh glow of a massive curved desktop monitor sitting on her professional editing desk. I asked her what was going on. I demanded to know why we were hiding in the dark. She did not say a single word. She just pointed a shaking finger at a rolling swivel chair and told me to sit down. My heart was hammering relentlessly against my ribs. I sat down and forced myself to look at the bright screen. It was a wide, candid shot of my living room taken during the height of the rehearsal dinner. The foreground was beautifully focused and exposed. It showed Harrison and 3 of his groomsmen laughing uproariously while holding up crystal glasses of champagne. The lighting was warm and festive, but Jess did not care about the happy scene in the foreground. She placed her hand on her computer mouse. She told me that professional cameras capture massive files called raw images. They record an incredible amount of data and light even in the dark, unfocused areas of the frame. She clicked a tool on her editing software. The image on the screen zoomed in dramatically, bypassing the groomsmen and plunging deep into the background of the house. Specifically, the camera zoomed in on the dark hallway leading toward my private home office. My office is strictly off-limits to all guests. The door is always shut and locked. In the digitally zoomed photo, the lighting in the hallway was dim, but the high-resolution data was undeniable. I could clearly see Chloe standing in the hallway. She was wearing her white rehearsal dress. She was leaning casually against the wall, but her head was turned sharply, looking back over her shoulder toward the noisy party in the living room. She was not mingling. She was actively standing guard. She was acting as a lookout. And the heavy oak door to my office was wide open. Jess moved her mouse again. She adjusted a slider on her screen that increased the exposure and lifted the heavy shadows inside the office. The breath was completely, violently punched out of my lungs. The The darkness faded away, revealing the floor behind my heavy mahogany desk. There was a man kneeling on the carpet. It was Trent, Chloe's supposed brother. He had rolled back the heavy Persian rug. He was bent directly over my steel floor safe, the safe where I kept my most sensitive legal documents, my estate trust, and my late wife's priceless heirloom jewelry. In his hands, he held a small silver tension wrench and a professional lock-picking set. He was actively cracking my safe while 50 people drank my wine just 30 feet away. I stared at the glowing monitor, completely paralyzed by shock. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I turned to Jess and told her we needed to dial 911 immediately. I told her my new family had broken into my safe and committed a felony. I reached into my pocket for my phone, but Jess gently placed her trembling hand over mine. She told me to wait. She said I did not understand the full scope of what was happening yet. She explained that her camera takes rapid burst photos capturing multiple frames every second. She said I needed to see the next sequence of timestamps. Jess clicked a button on her keyboard, loading the next heavy file. The timestamp in the corner of the screen indicated this photo was taken exactly 5 minutes after the first one. The camera angle had slightly shifted as Jess had moved through the crowd, but it was still aimed down that dark hallway. Trent was now standing outside the office door. He was standing shoulder to shoulder with Chloe. The safe was presumably locked back up and hidden under the rug. But Trent was holding up his right hand. Pinched between his fingers was a small black digital thumb drive. He was showing it to someone standing just out of the camera's frame. Jess slowly panned the digital image to the right. A third figure stepped into the hallway light. It was my own son, Harrison. I expected to see rage on Harrison's face. I expected to see him catching the thieves in the act and defending my home. But Harrison was not angry. He was not shouting. Harrison was calmly reaching into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. In the razor-sharp, high-definition image, I watched my son pull out a thick, folded manila envelope. I watched him hand it directly to Trent. The top flap of the envelope was bent open. I could clearly, vividly see thick, banded stacks of $100 bills shoved inside. My mind went entirely blank. The room started to spin. My chest tightened with a pain so sharp and profound, I genuinely thought my heart was failing. I had not just been robbed by a greedy daughter-in-law and her criminal brother. My own son had orchestrated it. My own son had paid them cash to infiltrate my home and steal my future. My own son had financed the heist of my life. I left Jess in her dark studio and walked back out into the bright morning sun. The air felt heavy and suffocating in my lungs. My mind was racing at 1,000 miles an hour, but my body felt completely numb. I climbed into my truck and gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned a bruised white. The drive back to my suburban neighborhood was a chaotic blur of traffic lights and brake lights. The morning commuters around me were drinking coffee and listening to the radio, completely oblivious to the fact that my entire reality had just been violently dismantled. Any normal person would have grabbed their cell phone and dialed 911 right then and there. A normal father might have called his son screaming into the receiver, demanding answers and threatening to burn the world down. But I am not built that way. I spent 40 years running regional logistics for a massive freight corporation. I managed complex supply chains across the country. I handled crises ranging from derailed cargo trains in Chicago to missing commercial shipments in Denver. When a massive container goes missing or a crucial supply chain breaks, you do not panic. You do not make wild emotional accusations without holding the solid paper trail in your hand. You lock down the warehouse. You secure the perimeter. You take an immediate physical inventory. You figure out exactly what was stolen before you declare war. I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine. I sat in the cab of my truck for a long time, just staring at the front door of my own home. The house looked exactly the same as it did when I left it 2 hours ago. The front lawn was perfectly manicured. The wooden porch swing moved slightly in the gentle morning breeze. The flower beds my late wife Sarah had planted were blooming beautifully, but it no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like an active crime scene. The walls I had paid for the roof, I had repaired the porch where I drank my morning coffee. It had all been violated. I unlocked the front heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The silence of the house usually brought me a deep sense of peace, but today it felt mocking and cruel. I walked straight past the kitchen and down the main hallway toward my private office. Every single step I took felt like walking through deep, freezing water. I looked at the framed family photographs hanging on the hallway walls. Pictures of Harrison as a little boy playing baseball. Pictures of Sarah smiling on our 25th wedding anniversary. I felt a sickening wave of nausea wash over me. I reached the heavy oak door of my office. It was closed and locked, just as I always left it. But I knew the terrible truth now. That brass lock meant absolutely nothing. I took out my key, turned it, and pushed the door open. The office was perfectly organized. My large mahogany desk was polished and clean. My filing cabinets were fully shut. I walked around to the back of the desk and looked down at the heavy, dark Persian rug covering the floor. I knelt down on the hardwood and rolled the thick fabric back. The cold steel face of my secure floor safe stared up at me from the ground. I placed my trembling fingers on the combination dial. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to stop, close my eyes, and take a deep breath to steady my nerves. I spun the heavy dial. Right 32, left 14, right 55. The massive internal tumblers clicked heavily into place. I grabbed the handle and pulled the thick steel door open. A rush of stale metallic air hit my face. I reached inside the dark cavity, fully anticipating an empty metal box. I expected to find my life completely cleaned out and stripped bare. But my fingers brushed against the familiar soft velvet of my late wife's jewelry box. I pulled it out into the light and opened the lid. Her brilliant diamond engagement ring, her elegant pearl necklace, and her heavy gold tennis bracelet were all sitting there completely untouched. The diamonds caught the light from my desk lamp. I reached back into the dark safe. My emergency cash envelope containing exactly $10,000 in $50 bills was sitting perfectly where I had left it months ago. I sat back on my heels, completely confused. A professional grifter and my own son had meticulously cracked my safe during a crowded, noisy party. They had the perfect opportunity to walk away with tens of thousands of dollars in untraceable cash and easily pawned diamonds. But they left the physical valuables completely alone. Why would a coordinated team of thieves break into a highly secure vault and leave the gold sitting right there? The answer hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. They were not looking for a quick payday. They were not petty smash and grab thieves. They were playing a much larger, much more dangerous game. I reached into the very back of the deep safe and pulled out a heavy black leather binder. It was my comprehensive estate trust. This binder contained the entire legal blueprint of my life. It held the original deeds to my house, the clear titles to my vehicles, the routing numbers for my vast retirement accounts, and the detailed legal instructions for my medical care. It was a dense document I had meticulously crafted with my longtime estate lawyer to ensure Harrison would be financially taken care of after I passed away naturally. I placed the heavy binder on my desk, turned on my brass reading lamp, and opened the thick leather cover. I began to review the document page by page. I applied the exact same ruthless attention to detail that had made me the most feared and respected supply chain auditor in my company. At first glance, everything appeared to be in perfect working order. The table of contents was entirely accurate. The asset schedules listing my stock portfolios were correct. The early pages detailing my basic funeral wishes remained completely unaltered. But then I reached Section 3, the crucial section governing my medical directives and the absolute power of attorney. As I turned to page 14, my thumb suddenly stopped. When you handle sensitive corporate paperwork for 4 decades, your hands develop an incredible memory for physical texture. The paper grain on page 14 felt marginally different from the paper grain on page 13. It was slightly thicker. It lacked the faint crispness of the original premium stationery my lawyer always used. I leaned in very close to the desk lamp holding the page directly under the bright bulb. I looked at the heavy-duty staple binding the thick packet together in the top left corner. The thick metal prongs had been subtly pried open and then pressed back down. The metal was slightly warped. Someone had meticulously, completely removed this specific page and swapped it with a flawless counterfeit replacement. I sat down in my leather desk chair and began to read the text on the forged page. The legal jargon was dense and complex, but its true meaning was terrifyingly clear. The original safe document stated that my son Harrison would only gain financial control of my estate if I were to pass away or be permanently incapacitated by a severe medical trauma like a massive stroke or a major heart attack. The forged amendment changed absolutely everything. It legally granted Harrison immediate and absolutely irrevocable medical and financial power of attorney. He no longer needed me to die to take total control of my assets. He just needed to trigger one specific devious clause cleverly written into the bottom paragraph of the page. I read the clause aloud to the empty, silent room. The transfer of absolute financial and medical authority will be triggered immediately upon the formal medical diagnosis of cognitive decline or early onset dementia by a licensed medical professional. The air in my home office felt suddenly completely unbreathable. The sheer evil of their coordinated plan washed over me, freezing the blood in my veins. They did not just want to drain my bank accounts and run away. They wanted to permanently steal my autonomy. They wanted to trap me in my own aging body and declare me legally incompetent. If I drove to the police station right now screaming that my son and his new wife were trying to steal my life, they would simply use my justified anger against me. They would point to my erratic yelling behavior as absolute proof that my mind was rapidly failing. They were actively building a cage around me using the state legal system as the iron bars. And Harrison, my own boy, the child I had sacrificed everything for, was happily holding the key. He had completely sold me out. He was preparing to strip me of my constitutional rights, lock me away in some sterile assisted living facility, and inherit my millions while I was still drawing breath. I looked closely at the bottom of the terrible page. There was a legitimate-looking blue notary stamp placed perfectly next to a flawless, masterful forgery of my own signature. It was a perfect, inescapable legal trap. I sat in my chair completely paralyzed by the crushing weight of my discovery. The silence of the house was absolute and terrifying. Then suddenly the shrill, jarring ring of my home landline shattered the quiet. The loud noise made me physically jump. I stared at the old dusty phone sitting on the corner of my mahogany desk. I never used the landline anymore. I only kept it active out of sheer habit. The only people who ever call that specific number are automated telemarketers and automated pharmacy prescription reminders. The phone rang a second time, echoing loudly down the empty hallway. Then it rang a third time. It sounded demanding. It felt incredibly urgent. I reached out with a violently trembling hand and picked up the plastic receiver. I brought it to my ear and managed to force out a weak hello. A highly polite, professional woman's voice immediately responded. She asked if she was speaking with Mr. Thomas Barrett. I cleared my dry throat and told her she was. She introduced herself as a senior agent from the Primary Fraud Prevention Department at my main bank. The agent politely apologized for disturbing my quiet morning. She explained that their automated internal security system had just flagged an unusually large transaction, a attempting to clear my primary retirement savings account. She said they were calling to verbally verify the massive transfer before they officially released the funds into the system. I asked her what transfer she was talking about. I fought with everything I had to keep my voice as steady and calm as possible, swallowing the rising panic burning in my throat. I could hear the agent typing rapidly on her mechanical keyboard. She read the transaction details back to me in a calm, measured, professional tone. She said they needed me to personally authorize a domestic wire transfer in the amount of $350,000. She told me the wire transfer had been initiated in their system exactly 10 minutes ago. I gripped the edge of my desk. I asked her who exactly had initiated the transfer. The bank agent paused for a brief moment. Then she delivered the final, completely crushing blow. She said the massive transfer was requested in person just moments ago at their downtown branch office by my son, Harrison Barrett. She calmly explained that Harrison had just presented a legally binding power of attorney document to the branch manager, along with a signed medical affidavit from a doctor stating that I was suffering from severe dementia and was no longer legally capable of managing my own finances. The trap had not just been set in the shadows. The trap had just violently sprung shut around my neck. I gripped the plastic receiver of my home telephone so tightly, my hand began to cramp. The bank agent was waiting on the other end of the line for my response. She had just informed me that my own son was standing inside the downtown branch, attempting to wire $350,000 out of my retirement account, using a forged, legal document. My heart was pounding against my ribs like a trapped animal, but 40 years of corporate logistics training immediately kicked in. I knew that if I screamed or panicked, the bank would simply follow standard security protocols. They might involve the local authorities immediately and tip off Harrison before I understood the full scope of his operation. I needed to freeze that money right now without raising any red flags that could alert the thieves. I forced my breathing to slow down. I lowered my voice and spoke to the agent in the calmest, most apologetic tone I could muster. I told her there had been a terrible misunderstanding. I explained that my son was helping me manage some new real estate investments, but he had completely mixed up the transfer dates and the account routing numbers. I let out a soft, manufactured chuckle and told her that Harrison was always terrible with paperwork. I instructed her to cancel the wire transfer immediately and put a temporary freeze on the account, just in case any more automated clerical errors occurred. I assured her I would drive down to the branch in person to sort out the confusion with the branch manager. The agent sounded relieved. She told me she would halt the wire and flag the account for my arrival. I hung up the phone and stood alone in my quiet home office. The air felt thick and poisoned. I looked down at the forged power of attorney document still sitting on my mahogany desk. The pristine counterfeit page mocked me. My son had not just hired criminals to break into my safe. He was actively executing a hostile takeover of my entire existence. I closed the heavy leather binder, locked it back inside the floor safe, and rolled the Persian rug over the steel door. I grabbed my truck keys and walked out of the house. I did not bother locking the front door. The locks on my home meant absolutely nothing anymore. The true danger was already inside the walls. The drive to the downtown bank branch took exactly 22 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. The morning sun was bright and cheerful, completely disconnected from the dark nightmare unfolding inside my vehicle. As I drove, my mind shifted into a cold, calculating gear. I began to map out the supply chain of Harrison's betrayal. He needed money fast. You do not attempt to steal $350,000 in broad daylight, unless you are desperate. But the forged medical power of attorney indicated a long-term strategy. They were trying to build a permanent pipeline into my finances. To do that, they needed to remove my ability to fight back. They needed the rest of the world to look at me and see a broken, confused old man who could not be trusted to manage his own affairs. I pulled my truck into the bank parking lot and parked in a spot far away from the front doors. I sat in the cab for a moment watching the entrance. I half expected to see Harrison walking out with a smug smile on his face, but the entrance was clear. I stepped out of the truck and walked into the grand lobby of the bank. The building was old and imposing, with high marble ceilings and thick glass teller windows. For 30 years, I had trusted this institution to protect the wealth my wife and I had bled to build. Now it felt like a courthouse where I was about to be put on trial for my own sanity. I walked directly to the front desk and asked to speak with the branch manager. His name was David Vance. David was a sharp, professional man in his early 50s. We had played golf together a few times over the years. The receptionist recognized me and immediately escorted me back to his private office. David was sitting behind his large glass desk, looking deeply uncomfortable. He stood up when I walked in and offered me his hand. His grip was firm, but his eyes carried a heavy, sympathetic weight. That look of pity sent a cold shiver down my spine. It was the exact look you give to a man who has just been diagnosed with a terminal illness. David closed his office door and gestured for me to sit down in the leather guest chair. He sighed heavily and folded his hands on his desk. He told me he was incredibly sorry for the morning confusion, but he was legally obligated to follow the directives presented to him by my appointed guardian. Hearing the word guardian applied to me, a fully independent 68-year-old man, made my stomach violently churn. I looked at David and kept my voice perfectly level. I asked him to show me exactly what paperwork Harrison had submitted to authorize the massive wire transfer. David unlocked his top desk drawer and pulled out a thick manila folder. He opened it and slid 2 documents across the glass desk toward me. The first document was a freshly notarized copy of the exact same forged power of attorney page I had just found inside my floor safe. It looked flawless. The legal stamps were perfectly placed. My forged signature was terrifyingly accurate, but it was the second document that made the blood freeze in my veins. It was a formal medical affidavit printed on the official letterhead of a prominent local neurology clinic. The top of the page bore the name Dr. Samuel Aris. I had never heard of this doctor in my entire life. I picked up the paper and began to read the typed diagnosis. Every single word felt like a physical knife twisting in my ribs. The document stated that I had been suffering from severe cognitive decline for the past 8 months. It claimed that I was experiencing dangerous memory lapses, acute paranoia, and sudden aggressive outbursts. The affidavit concluded with a formal medical recommendation that I be immediately stripped of my financial autonomy for my own safety and placed under the permanent legal guardianship of my next of kin. I sat in the quiet office staring at the horrific lies printed on the medical letterhead. The trap was so incredibly elegant, it made me sick to my stomach. If a bank manager reads a doctor's note claiming an old man is paranoid and prone to aggressive outbursts, what happens when that old man starts screaming that his son is a criminal mastermind? What happens if I pound my fist on the glass desk and demand the police be called? The bank manager will look at my anger and see the exact symptoms described in the forged medical file. My righteous fury would become the absolute proof of my supposed insanity. Every single attempt I made to defend myself loudly would simply hammer another nail into my own coffin. David leaned forward and spoke in a soft, careful voice. He told me he managed to pause the wire transfer because I had called in time, but his hands were completely tied going forward. He explained that because the medical power of attorney was now officially logged in their corporate system and legally recorded with the county, Harrison had ultimate legal control over my accounts. David told me that the only way to permanently freeze the funds and block Harrison from draining my life savings was to obtain an emergency injunction from a state judge. He said I would need to hire an independent lawyer, petition the court, and undergo a rigorous psychological evaluation by a state-appointed doctor to prove the initial diagnosis was fraudulent. I calculated the timeline in my head. Securing a court date, filing legal motions, and scheduling a state medical evaluation could take weeks or even months. Harrison and his fake brother-in-law, Trent, could drain every single penny I owned, transfer the cash to offshore accounts, and vanish into the wind long before I ever saw the inside of a courtroom. They had used the slow, bureaucratic nature of the legal system as a weapon against me. They knew I could not fight them through traditional channels fast enough to save my money. I looked up from the forged documents and met David's sympathetic gaze. I knew exactly what I had to do. The logistics director inside me took complete control of my brain. If I wanted to survive this, I could not act like a strong, capable man demanding justice. I had to become the exact victim they had written into their script. I had to play the role of the confused, tired, fading old man. I had to let them believe their trap was working perfectly, so they would drop their guard. I allowed my shoulders to slump. I let my hands tremble slightly as I placed the papers back on the desk. I looked at David with wide, lost eyes. I told him I was just so very tired lately. I mumbled that Harrison was a good boy, and he was probably just trying to help his old dad manage things. I apologized to David for taking up his valuable morning time and told him I would go home and take a long nap. The look of profound pity on David's face deepened. He nodded softly and told me to take care of myself, Mr. Barrett. He bought the performance completely. My heart broke a little more, realizing how easily society is willing to write off an older man the moment a piece of paper suggests his mind is going. I stood up slowly, leaning heavily on the armrests of the chair, as if my joints were aching. I walked out of David's office and slowly shuffled through the grand bank lobby. The security guard held the heavy glass door open for me, and I stepped back out into the bright morning sunlight. The heat of the day was beginning to rise, but I felt cold down to my very bones. I had just learned that my money was no longer mine. My legal identity had been stolen. My own son was actively trying to erase me from the world. I walked across the vast asphalt parking lot toward my truck. I needed to get back to my house. I needed to call Jess, the photographer, and tell her to lock down those digital photos. I needed to find a private investigator who operated entirely outside the slow, traditional legal system. I was going to dismantle Harrison and his criminal friends piece by piece, but I had to do it completely in the shadows. As I approached the rear bumper of my truck, I stopped dead in my tracks. The keys in my hand suddenly felt like heavy lead weights. Standing there, leaning casually against the driver's side door of my vehicle, was Harrison. He was wearing a crisp, expensive navy blue suit, the same suit he had worn to the bank to steal my money. His hair was perfectly styled, and he was holding a paper cup of expensive coffee from the cafe down the street. When he saw me walking toward him, a bright, warm smile spread across his face. It was the exact same smile he used to give me when he was 10 years old and wanted money for the ice cream truck. It was a smile filled with absolute deceptive innocence. My stomach recoiled in disgust, but I forced my face to remain perfectly blank. I could not let him see the rage boiling in my veins. I could not let him know that I had seen the photographs or read the forged medical affidavit. I had to play the confused old man. I took a slow, hesitant step forward and looked at him with mild, manufactured surprise. Harrison pushed himself off the door of the truck and walked toward me. He reached out and placed a warm, comforting hand on my shoulder. His touch felt like a poisonous snake slithering across my skin. He looked deeply into my eyes, and his voice dripped with thick, sickening concern. He asked me what I was doing downtown so early in the morning. He said he was driving by and recognized my truck in the lot. He chuckled softly and said he was worried about me driving in the heavy city traffic all by myself. He asked if I was getting confused with my morning routine again. I looked at my son. I looked at the man who had stood in my living room, accepted $80,000 of my hard-earned money for a fake wedding, and then handed an envelope of cash to a criminal to crack my safe. I let my jaw go slightly slack. I blinked slowly and told him I just needed to talk to the bank about a small clerical error. I told him I was feeling a bit overwhelmed and just wanted to go home and lie down. Harrison squeezed my shoulder gently. His smile never wavered, but his eyes were completely dead and cold. He told me that going home to rest was a wonderful idea. He said he and Chloe were going to come over to my house later that evening to cook me a nice, healthy dinner. He told me I needed to start taking better care of my failing health. Then Harrison reached into his suit jacket pocket. He pulled out a small orange plastic prescription bottle with a crisp white label. He held it up in the morning sunlight and rattled the pills inside. The sound was like a rattlesnake warning its prey. Harrison looked at me with absolute terrifying calm. He told me he had stopped by the pharmacy on his way to the bank. He said Dr. Eris had prescribed me a brand new blood pressure medication to help with my episodes of confusion. He pressed the orange bottle firmly into my trembling hand. He leaned in close, his breath smelling like expensive coffee and peppermint. He whispered that he would personally make sure I took my new medication every single night from now on. I looked down at the orange plastic bottle in my hand. I knew exactly what was inside. It was not blood pressure medication. It was the final phase of their plan. They were not just going to drain my bank accounts and lock me in an asylum. They were going to chemically ensure that I never woke up to fight back. I spent the entire afternoon sitting in the suffocating silence of my own house, staring at the orange plastic pill bottle on the kitchen counter. It felt heavy with absolute malice. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to drive to the police station and throw the bottle on the detective's desk. But my rational mind, the mind that managed massive corporate supply chains for 4 decades, held me back. I knew that without hard, undeniable proof, the police would look at the forged medical documents and dismiss me as a paranoid old man having a mental breakdown. I had to play their twisted game. I had to make them believe they were winning so they would become arrogant and make a fatal mistake. At 5 o'clock, my cell phone buzzed. It was Harrison calling to confirm our dinner plans. I answered the phone and deliberately softened my voice. I made my words sound slightly slurred and hesitant. I told him I was feeling incredibly tired and confused about my morning at the bank. I apologized for being a burden. I could actually hear the sickening smile in his voice as he spoke to me. He told me not to worry about a single thing. He said he and Chloe had cooked a wonderful, healthy meal just for me. He told me to come over so they could take good care of me. I agreed and hung up the phone. A cold, deep rage settled into the very marrow of my bones. I drove to their house as the sun began to set. It was a beautiful, modern 2-story home in a wealthy suburban subdivision. I knew exactly how beautiful it was because I had paid the massive down payment for them as a wedding gift. I had written a check for $40,000 just so they could have a safe place to start their family. Now that very same house was going to be the staging ground for my psychological execution. I walked up the manicured front path and knocked on the heavy wooden door. Harrison opened it immediately, wearing a casual sweater and a warm, welcoming smile. He pulled me into a tight hug. I felt physically sick, pressing my face against the shoulder of the son, who was actively plotting my demise, but I forced my arms to wrap around him. I patted his back and played the role of the frail, grateful father. When I walked into the dining room, my stomach immediately dropped. Chloe was setting the table, but she was not alone. Her fake brother Trent was sitting casually at the head of the long wooden table, drinking a glass of expensive red wine. The criminal who had picked my floor safe just days ago was sitting in my son's house, acting like an honored guest. Trent looked up at me and flashed a bright, predatory grin. He asked me how I was feeling. He said I looked a little pale and tired. I forced a weak, polite smile and told him I was just getting old. We sat down for dinner. The meal was an elaborate spread of roasted chicken and fresh vegetables, but it tasted like absolute ash in my mouth. I kept my head down and ate slowly. It did not take long for their coordinated attack to begin. It started with my car keys. When I walked into the house, I had deliberately placed my heavy ring of keys directly next to my dinner plate. It is a lifelong habit. But when Chloe asked me to pass the salt shaker, I turned my head for just 2 seconds. When I looked back, my keys were completely gone. I patted my pockets and looked under my napkin. I asked the table if anyone had seen my keys. Harrison stopped chewing and looked at me with deep, exaggerated concern. He slowly put his fork down and sighed. He said, "Dad, you left your keys by the front door when you walked in. You did not bring them to the table." I looked at the front door down the hallway. My keys were resting on the entry console table 20 feet away. Trent had quietly slipped them off the table and moved them while I was distracted. I felt a flash of pure heat rise in my chest. I knew exactly what I did with my keys, but I forced my face to drop into a mask of pure confusion. I rubbed my eyes and apologized. I said my memory was just playing tricks on me today. Chloe reached across the table and patted my hand. She told me it was okay and that dementia is a very difficult disease to accept. Hearing her say that word out loud made my blood turn to ice. 10 minutes later, they escalated the psychological torture. I decided to test them. I began telling a fond story about a camping trip Harrison and I took to the lake when he was 12 years old. I described the old green tent we used and the massive trout he caught. I spoke slowly and clearly. Right in the middle of my sentence, Harrison abruptly slammed his hand down on the table. The loud noise made me physically flinch. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and intense frustration. He raised his voice and told me to please stop talking. He said, "Dad, you literally just told us that exact same story not even 5 minutes ago. You are repeating yourself again." Trent chimed in, shaking his head sadly. He said it is really tough to watch a good man lose his mind like this. I had not told the story. We had been sitting in total silence for 5 minutes before I spoke. They were deliberately gaslighting me. They were trying to shatter my grip on reality. They wanted me to scream. They wanted me to stand up, pound my fists on the dining table, and angrily demand that they stop lying. I glanced to my right and saw exactly why they wanted me to explode. Trent had casually propped his large smartphone up against a ceramic water pitcher. The dark lens of the camera was pointed directly at my face. The screen was completely black, but I could see the tiny, faint red recording light blinking near the top bezel. They were filming me. They were actively trying to provoke an unhinged, violent outburst, so they could submit the video footage to the state judge as absolute, undeniable proof of my dangerous mental decline. In the corporate world of heavy logistics, negotiations, you learn to control your physical reactions. When a hostile competitor attempts to back you into a corner and destroy your entire operation, you do not show them anger. Anger is a weakness. Anger is a measurable metric they can use to map your next move. I drew upon 40 years of high-pressure boardroom survival. I buried my righteous fury so deep inside my chest that it completely disappeared from my face. I did not yell. I did not glare at the hidden camera. Instead, I let my shoulders slump forward in total defeat. I looked at Harrison with wet, glistening eyes. I apologized profusely. I told him I was just so terribly embarrassed by my failing brain. I thanked him for being so patient with me. I played the pathetic, broken victim perfectly. I could see a brief flash of deep disappointment cross Trent's face. He knew he had failed to capture the angry meltdown he desperately needed for the courts. After dinner, Chloe stood up and walked into the kitchen. She returned a few moments later carrying a large, steaming ceramic mug. She placed it gently on the table directly in front of me. The liquid inside was dark brown and smelled strongly of bitter herbs and peppermint. Chloe smiled sweetly and told me she had brewed a very special herbal tea just for me. She said it was a natural remedy designed to lower my blood pressure and help me sleep through the night. She insisted that I drink the entire cup before I drove home. I looked down at the dark, steaming liquid. I remembered the orange plastic pill bottle sitting on my kitchen counter. I remembered the forged medical diagnosis. I knew with absolute terrifying certainty that this tea was heavily laced with sedatives, or perhaps something much worse. They needed me incapacitated. They needed me weak. I picked up the mug with shaking hands and brought it to my lips. I blew on the hot liquid and pretended to take a small sip. I smiled warmly and told Chloe it was absolutely delicious. I thanked her for taking such good care of me. Then I waited. I waited until Harrison stood up to clear the dinner plates. I waited until Trent looked down at his phone to check a text message. I waited until Chloe turned her back to walk into the kitchen. In that split-second window of opportunity, I reached out and poured the entire contents of the heavy mug directly into the soil of a large potted ficus plant sitting next to the dining room window. I quickly placed the empty mug back onto my saucer just as Chloe turned around. I wiped my mouth with my napkin and let out a long, exaggerated yawn. I blinked heavily and told them the tea was already making me feel incredibly sleepy. I said I needed to go home and get straight into bed before I fell asleep at the wheel. Harrison immediately rushed over to help me stand up. He grabbed my arm with a firm, controlling grip and walked me toward the front door. He handed me my car keys and told me to drive very slowly. He said he would call me in the morning to check on my condition. I nodded weakly and walked out into the cool evening air. I heard the heavy front door click shut and lock behind me. I walked down the concrete driveway toward my truck. The cool night air felt like absolute heaven against my flushed skin. I had survived their dinner. I had navigated their trap without giving them a single piece of ammunition. But as I reached my vehicle, I realized I needed more information. I needed to know exactly what their timeline was. I needed to hear how they spoke about me when they thought I was completely gone. I reached into the bed of my truck and left my heavy winter coat sitting on the tailgate. I turned around and walked silently back up the driveway. I moved slowly, keeping my footsteps extremely light on the concrete. I stepped onto the front porch and approached the heavy wooden door. Harrison had closed the door, but the heavy metal latch had not completely engaged. It was cracked open just a tiny fraction of an inch, allowing a thin sliver of warm yellow light to spill out onto the dark porch. I pressed my back against the brick wall and leaned my head carefully toward the narrow opening. The house was quiet for a moment. Then I heard Trent speak. His voice was no longer casual or friendly. It was cold, sharp, and entirely devoid of human empathy. Trent told Harrison that the hidden camera did not get anything useful. He complained that I was just a sad, pathetic old man who refused to put up a fight. Then Harrison replied, "The sound of my own son's voice, completely stripped of all affection, hit me like a physical bullet to the chest." Harrison told Trent not to worry about the video footage anymore. He said the forged medical documents they filed at the bank this morning were completely sufficient to secure the financial power of attorney by the end of the month. But it was Trent's next sentence that froze the very blood in my veins. Trent laughed, a low, harsh sound. He told Harrison that they could not afford to wait until the end of the month for the courts to finalize the guardianship paperwork. Trent said the illegal sports syndicate was demanding their money by next Friday, or they were going to start breaking legs. Trent paced across the hardwood floor, and his voice dropped to a terrifyingly calm level. He said the old man drank the entire mug of sedatives. He said I would be completely unconscious in my bed within the hour. Trent told Harrison that the life insurance policy I had updated last year included a triple payout for accidental death in the home. Trent stated that the old man is fading fast anyway. He said as soon as the life insurance policy transfers to the primary account, next week we finalize the probate and pay off the bookies. Trent told Harrison that my brakes were going to accidentally fail at the bottom of the steep hill near my house tomorrow morning. I stood frozen on the dark porch. The cold night air rushed into my lungs. They were not just trying to steal my money or declare me legally incompetent anymore. The timeline had aggressively accelerated. My own son had just agreed to murder me. I did not sleep a single second that night. I lay flat on my back in the center of my bed, staring up at the dark ceiling fan. The absolute silence of my house pressed down on me like a physical weight. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the cold, callous sound of my own son's voice agreeing to my murder. I heard Trent casually discussing my fatal car accident, as if they were planning a weekend golf trip. For a few agonizing hours, I felt a profound, crushing sorrow. I wept for my late wife, Sarah. I wept for the boy I had raised, who was now completely gone, replaced by a greedy, desperate stranger. But right around 4 a.m, the sorrow finally burned itself out. What replaced it was not just anger. It was a cold, hardened, hyper-focused, absolute resolve. The logistics director inside me completely took over. They wanted to treat my life like a supply chain they could simply disrupt and liquidate. I was going to show them what happens when the architect of that supply chain decides to burn the entire warehouse down. When the morning sun finally broke through my bedroom window, I got out of bed and dressed in my oldest, dirtiest gardening clothes. I needed to look exactly like the harmless, fading, retired man they believed me to be. I walked out my back door and slipped quietly through the wooden privacy fence into my neighbor's yard. I made sure I was completely out of sight of the street, just in case Trent or Harrison had decided to park down the block and watch my house. I walked 2 solid miles to a small rundown gas station on the edge of the county line. I paid cash for a cheap prepaid burner phone and a massive cup of bitter black coffee. I stood behind the brick gas station next to a rusted commercial dumpster and dialed a phone number I had memorized nearly a decade ago. The man who answered the phone was Bill. Bill was a retired state trooper who used to handle massive organized cargo theft investigations for my shipping hubs. He was ruthless, meticulous, and entirely immune to emotional manipulation. Now he ran a highly private intelligence and security firm. I told Bill I needed his absolute discretion, and I needed him on the clock immediately. I explained that my life was in active physical danger, and the people pulling the trigger were my own family members. Bill did not ask any unnecessary questions or offer empty sympathies. He simply asked for my current coordinates and told me to keep my head down. I walked the 2 miles back to my quiet neighborhood and slipped back inside my house through the rear patio door. The absolute moment I stepped into my kitchen, my regular cell phone began to ring loudly on the granite counter. The caller identification displayed Harrison's name. I took a deep, steadying breath, forcing my heart rate to slow down. I dropped my shoulders and forced my voice to drop an octave. I answered the phone, sounding weak, tired, and slightly disoriented. Harrison asked me how I had slept, and if the special tea Chloe made had helped me rest. I told him I had slept like a rock, but I woke up feeling terribly confused and sore all over. I manufactured a small, pathetic cough and complained about my memory slipping. I told him I could not even remember where I had put my truck keys, and I was just going to stay home all day and watch old television game shows. Harrison sounded absolutely thrilled by my apparent deterioration. His voice was thick with fake concern as he told me to rest up and promised he would check on me later. I hung up the phone and felt a violent wave of pure disgust wash over me. I had to maintain this pathetic, agonizing facade every single hour of the day. If I showed even a hint of my true strength or awareness, they would undoubtedly accelerate their violent timeline. I spent the next 3 days living a terrifying double life. To Harrison and his criminal friends, I was a fading ghost of a man. I deliberately misplaced my daily mail. I left the backyard garden hose running until the grass flooded. I played the perfect helpless victim. But the moment the doors were locked and the blinds were drawn, I was a man preparing for total war. Oh. On Thursday morning, I executed the first major phase of my counterattack. I called Harrison and told him I was taking a local taxi to the hardware store to buy some birdseed for the feeders. Instead, I had the taxi driver take me 3 towns over to the private office of my longtime estate attorney. His name was Richard. Richard had drafted my original trust alongside my late wife, Sarah, decades ago. When I walked into his private mahogany office and explained the forged medical documents and the safe cracking, he was completely horrified. He immediately reached for his desk phone, wanting to call the federal authorities and the local police right that second. I slammed my hand down on his desk and told him to stop. I explained the grim logistics of the situation. I told Richard that if we brought the police in right now without undeniable proof of the murder plot, Harrison and his friends would simply vanish into the wind. I would spend the rest of my short life looking over my shoulder, waiting for a cut brake line or a poisoned cup of coffee. I told Richard I needed to build a financial fortress that they could not breach, no matter what forged power of attorney documents they held in their hands. Richard understood exactly what I needed. He immediately went to work, drafting a highly classified, airtight legal document known as a springing trust. It was a completely new, impenetrable legal entity that instantly superseded and permanently nullified every single prior power of attorney or medical directive I had ever signed in my life. We systematically transferred every single dime of my wealth directly into this new trust. The house, the heavy retirement accounts, the massive life insurance policy, and the emergency funds were all locked behind this new legal wall. I named a neutral third-party corporate fiduciary firm as the sole manager of the trust. I signed the heavy stack of paperwork and watched Richard lock the only existing physical copy inside his secure, fireproof bank vault, far away from my home. The trap was perfectly set. Harrison could parade his forged medical documents all over the county, but it would not matter one bit. He was legally holding the keys to an entirely empty vault. My assets were completely legally untouchable. I felt a massive weight lift off my tired shoulders, but I knew the hardest and most dangerous part was still ahead of me. My money was completely safe, but my physical life was still actively targeted by a team of desperate criminals. Friday morning, my cheap burner phone vibrated aggressively in my pocket. It was Bill, the private investigator. His voice was rough and entirely devoid of any emotion. He told me to meet him immediately at a quiet, rundown highway diner on the far outskirts of the county. I did not drive my truck. I did not trust the mechanical integrity of my truck ever since Trent had mentioned my brakes. Instead, I drove my late wife's old sedan, keeping my speed slow and steady. I pulled into the gravel parking lot of the diner and walked inside. The air smelled like stale grease and strong coffee. I saw Bill sitting alone in a dark corner booth nursing a ceramic mug. He looked incredibly grim. When I sat down across from him on the cracked vinyl seat, he did not offer any polite pleasantries. He reached down into his heavy leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, bulging manila folder. He dropped it flat onto the sticky Formica table. The heavy sound it made was like a judge banging a wooden gavel in a courtroom. Bill looked me dead in the eyes and told me he had spent the last 48 hours digging deep into Chloe and Trent's backgrounds. He said the lavish $80,000 wedding I had paid for was nothing but an elaborate theater production designed to blind me. Bill pushed a single piece of official paper across the table toward me. It was a certified background check document from the state of Nevada. Bill stated plainly and clearly that Chloe was not Harrison's legal wife. He told me the marriage certificate Harrison had filed locally in our county was a complete sophisticated fake. I stared at the state document in total disbelief. My mind struggled to process the information. I asked Bill what he meant by a fake marriage. I asked him who Chloe really was, if she was not legally married to my son. Bill leaned his heavy frame forward, resting his elbows on the table. He pushed a second piece of paper across the table. It was a certified, notarized copy of a legitimate marriage license from Clark County, Nevada. It was dated 5 years ago. I slowly read the names printed in bold ink on the official state document. Chloe and Trent. Bill confirmed my absolute worst nightmare. He said Chloe and Trent were not brother and sister. They were not even remotely related. They were legally married to each other. They were a highly successful husband and wife team of professional grifters who specifically targeted wealthy elderly widows and widowers. They specialized in infiltrating families, forging medical documents, and legally draining estates before vanishing across state lines. My lungs completely seized up. The air in the diner felt suddenly unbreathable. I looked at Bill and asked the most painful, terrifying question of my entire life. I asked him if my son knew about this. I asked if Harrison was just another innocent victim of their elaborate con. I prayed to God that my boy had just been fooled by a beautiful woman. Bill shook his head slowly, and a look of profound, heavy pity crossed his rugged face. He told me that Harrison was not a victim at all. Harrison was the chief architect of the entire operation. Bill opened the rest of the thick manila folder and revealed a massive stack of intercepted financial wire transfers and heavily encrypted text messages. Bill explained the brutal, undeniable truth. Harrison was hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt to an incredibly violent illegal sports gambling syndicate operating out of a major city. The criminal bookies had given Harrison a final non-negotiable deadline to pay his debts. Harrison had realized that his massive inheritance was locked safely away in my original estate trust. He knew he could not access a single penny of it while I was still alive and mentally competent. So Harrison actively sought out professional help. He found Trent and Chloe through his underground gambling connections. He explicitly hired the married grifters to come to our town and play the roles of the perfect innocent bride and her protective brother. My own son, the boy I had raised and loved with my entire soul, had intentionally brought professional, ruthless predators into my home. He had orchestrated a fake $80,000 wedding and a fake marriage just to help him legally drain my entire life savings before the syndicate broke his legs. And when the legal route proved too slow, my son had calmly agreed to let his fake brother-in-law murder me in cold blood. The boy I loved was dead. All that was left was a monster, and I was going to take him down. I sat in the dark corner booth of that run-down highway diner and stared at the certified documents scattered across the sticky table. My private investigator, Bill, sat across from me in total silence. He let the crushing reality of his words sink deep into my bones. My son was not a victim. My son was the architect. The lavish $80,000 wedding was a stage play. The beautiful bride was a hired criminal. The loving brother-in-law was a professional safecracker. And Harrison, my own flesh and blood, had orchestrated the entire nightmare to save himself from a violent, illegal sports gambling syndicate. A profound, heavy numbness washed over my entire body. I felt like a man who had just survived a massive heart attack, only to be told he had terminal cancer. For my entire life, I had believed my primary duty as a father was to protect my family. I had worked grueling 60-hour weeks at the freight yards in the freezing snow and the blistering heat to ensure Harrison would never know the pain of poverty. I had sacrificed my own dreams to build a rock-solid foundation for his future. But sitting there under the flickering fluorescent lights of the diner, I finally understood the terrible truth. I had not built a foundation. I had built a slaughterhouse, and my son was eagerly leading me right to the butcher block. I looked up at Bill. My voice was completely hollow. I asked him how deep Harrison was in with the syndicate. Bill leaned forward and kept his voice low. He told me Harrison owed the bookies nearly $500,000. He said Harrison had been gambling recklessly on offshore sports books for 3 years. He had leveraged his house, his cars, and his credit cards. Now the syndicate was tired of waiting. Bill explained that these were not men who sent angry letters in the mail. These were men who showed up at your house in the middle of the night with baseball bats and firearms. They had given Harrison an absolute final deadline: pay the debt or lose his legs and possibly his life. Bill told me Harrison panicked. He knew my estate was worth millions, but he also knew my original trust completely locked him out until I was dead. So Harrison reached out to the criminal underworld and hired Chloe and Trent to accelerate the process. I took a slow, deep breath. The logistics director inside me completely detached from the grieving father. The father was dead. The man sitting in the diner was a cold, calculating problem solver. I told Bill we needed to go to the federal authorities right now. I said we needed to take these intercepted text messages and these fake marriage certificates to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and have them all arrested for conspiracy. But Bill shook his head grimly. He held up a thick, calloused hand. He told me I needed to look at the entire chessboard before I made a move. Bill explained the brutal reality of the legal system. He said, if we went to the police right now with what we had, it would turn into a massive, messy civil dispute. Harrison and his lawyers would claim the texts were taken out of context. They would argue that the forged power of attorney was a tragic misunderstanding. The courts would freeze my assets for months while they investigated. But worse than that, Bill warned me about the syndicate. He said if Harrison went to jail right now, the bookies would never get their $500,000. And when violent criminals lose that much money, they look for the nearest deep pocket. Bill looked me dead in the eye and said, if Harrison defaults, the syndicate will come looking for you. They will know you have the money to cover your son's debt. You will spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, waiting for a bullet in the dark. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. Bill was absolutely right. A simple arrest would not solve the root of the problem. It would just transfer the danger directly onto my shoulders. I needed to dismantle the entire operation at once. I needed Harrison and the grifters to commit an undeniable, massive federal crime that would guarantee them decades in federal prison. And I needed to do it in a way that completely shielded my assets from the syndicate. I looked at Bill and told him we needed a honeypot. I explained that in the corporate shipping world, when we suspected a warehouse manager of stealing inventory, we did not just confront them. We left a massive, unrecorded shipment of high-value electronics sitting right in the middle of the floor. We let them think they had stumbled onto the score of a lifetime. We let their own greed blind them to the trap. I told Bill we needed to give Harrison and Trent a target so incredibly lucrative that they would completely abandon their slow, cautious, legal strategy. We needed them to become reckless. We needed them to attempt a massive wire fraud that would immediately trigger federal alarms. Bill slowly smiled. It was a dark, dangerous smile. He asked me exactly how much money it would take to make a desperate man lose his mind. I did not even hesitate. I told him $2 million. I left the diner and drove straight home. I walked into my private office and locked the heavy mahogany door behind me. I booted up my desktop computer and opened my professional financial software. I spent the next 4 hours meticulously crafting the perfect piece of bait. I used my decades of corporate accounting experience to forge a flawless, highly detailed offshore stock portfolio statement. I created a dummy corporation based in the Cayman Islands. I generated authentic-looking routing numbers, account balances, and yield projections. I printed the statement on heavy premium paper. The document clearly showed an available liquid cash balance of exactly $2.4 million in untraceable offshore bearer bonds. It looked absolutely real. It looked like the kind of secret emergency fund a paranoid old corporate executive would hide from the government. It It was the holy grail for a team of professional grifters. I took a bright red marker and wrote the words "highly confidential" on the top of the manila folder. I placed the forged statement inside and intentionally left the folder sitting right in the dead center of my desk. I made sure it was positioned so that anyone walking into the office could not possibly miss it. At midnight, my back patio door quietly unlocked. Bill stepped out of the shadows and slipped into my kitchen. He was carrying a heavy black duffel bag filled with state-of-the-art surveillance equipment. We did not turn on any lights. We worked in total, absolute silence, using only the faint glow of small tactical flashlights. Bill moved through my house like a ghost. He installed 4 microscopic high-definition cameras in my home office. One was hidden inside the spine of a thick, leather-bound dictionary on my bookshelf. Another was tucked into the upper corner of the air conditioning vent, perfectly angled to capture the entire desk. A third camera was drilled directly into the frame of the floor safe, and the final camera was placed in the hallway, pointing directly at the office door. Bill connected all the cameras to a secure encrypted cellular router hidden in the attic. He handed me a small, sleek tablet computer. He told me the cameras recorded flawless audio and video and instantly transmitted the live feed to this tablet, no matter where I was in the city. The trap was physically set. Now we just needed the rats to take the bait. The next morning, I initiated the sequence. I picked up my cell phone and called Harrison. I made sure my voice sounded incredibly frail and exhausted. I told him I was feeling very dizzy and confused. I said I had scheduled an emergency appointment with a specialist at the county hospital, and I would be out of the house for at least 5 or 6 hours. I told him I had left my back door unlocked for the gardener and asked if he could swing by the house later to lock it for me. Harrison eagerly agreed. His voice dripped with fake sympathy as he told me to take all the time I needed at the hospital. He promised he would go over to the house immediately and make sure everything was safe and secure. I hung up the phone and felt a surge of cold adrenaline. He took the bait perfectly. He thought he had 6 hours of completely uninterrupted access to my home. I drove my truck exactly 1 mile down the road and parked behind a large commercial shopping center. I sat in the cab of my truck, locked the doors, and opened the surveillance tablet. The high-definition live feed of my quiet, empty home office filled the screen. The trap was armed. The waiting began. For the first 30 minutes, nothing happened. The house was completely still. Then the hallway camera detected motion. The video feed silently switched to the corridor. I watched the heavy oak door of my office slowly push open. Trent stepped into the frame. He was wearing dark clothing and a pair of thin black leather gloves. Harrison walked in right behind him. My son was wearing a sharp, casual suit, looking completely relaxed as he invaded my inner sanctum. They did not look like family members checking on a sick father. They looked like professional predators hunting for loose meat. I watched the live feed as Trent immediately walked behind my desk. He began opening the filing cabinets, carefully rummaging through my old tax returns and utility bills. He was searching for any additional bank accounts they might have missed during their first sweep. Harrison stood by the door, acting as the lookout, exactly like Chloe had done on the night of the rehearsal dinner. Then Trent stopped moving. On the camera hidden in the air vent, I had a perfect top-down view of the desk. I watched Trent's gloved hand reach out and touch the red confidential folder I had left sitting right in the center of the leather blotter. He opened the folder and stared at the forged offshore financial statement. For 10 long seconds, Trent did not move a single muscle. He just stared at the piece of paper as if it were a glowing block of solid gold. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone. He snapped a high-resolution photograph of the document. Trent turned around and looked at Harrison. His face was completely flushed with greed. I turned the volume up on my tablet, pushing the tiny speaker to its absolute limit. Trent told Harrison to lock the door. His voice was shaking with intense, aggressive excitement. He slapped the forged paper with the back of his hand. He said the old man was hiding an absolute fortune. He read the number out loud to my son. $2.4 million in untraceable offshore bonds. I watched Harrison's face pale. My son walked over to the desk and stared at the paper. He looked completely stunned. He told Trent he had no idea this account existed. He said his father had never mentioned a single word about offshore investments. Trent began pacing back and forth across the Persian rug. The professional grifter had completely lost his cool. The sheer magnitude of the fake money had completely short-circuited his rational brain. He told Harrison that this changed absolutely everything. Harrison looked nervous. He asked Trent what they should do. He reminded Trent that the forged medical power of attorney was already filed at the local bank for the $350,000 transfer. He said they just needed to wait for the local bank to release those funds to pay off the sports syndicate. But Trent violently shook his head. The greed was radiating off him in waves. He told Harrison that $300,000 was absolute pocket change compared to this offshore account. Trent pointed a leather-clad finger directly at Harrison's chest. Trent told him to listen very closely. He said they were going to forget about the local bank transfer. He said local banks ask too many questions and have too many safeguards. But an offshore account in the Cayman Islands operated under entirely different rules. Trent explained that with the forged power of attorney documents, they could initiate a massive international wire transfer and completely drain the $2 million into their own shadow accounts in a matter of hours. I sat in my truck, gripping the steering wheel. The plan was working flawlessly. I was steering them away from my real money and walking them directly into a massive federal wire fraud trap. But then Trent delivered the final crushing blow. Trent leaned over my mahogany desk and looked Harrison directly in the eyes. The hidden microphone picked up every single chilling syllable of his new plan. Trent said the international wire transfer process would take exactly 4 business days to clear the foreign exchange holds. He said the $2 million would officially hit their accounts on Friday afternoon. Harrison nodded slowly. He asked Trent what they were going to do about me. He asked what would happen if I woke up and realized my secret account had been completely liquidated. Trent did not blink. His voice was completely devoid of any human soul. He told Harrison that the old man would never have the chance to realize a single thing. Trent said they were going to play the loving family for the next 4 days. They were going to keep me heavily sedated with Chloe's special herbal teas. And then on Friday night, the exact moment the $2 million cleared the offshore bank, Trent said they would trigger the final phase. Trent told my son they would slip the fatal dose of digitalis into my evening coffee. He said my heart would simply stop in my sleep. It would look like a natural tragedy, a sad old man whose body finally gave out. They would inherit the house, the cars, and the $2 million free and clear. The syndicate would be paid, and they would live like kings. I watched the live video feed as my son stood in my home office and slowly nodded his head. Harrison agreed to the plan. He agreed to murder me on Friday night for a pile of money that did not even exist. I turned off the tablet screen and sat in the dark cab of my truck. The clock was officially ticking. It was Monday morning. I had exactly 4 days to finalize my counterstrike. I had 4 days to build the ultimate public execution before my own flesh and blood tried to stop my heart forever. I knew that if I wanted to guarantee Harrison and his criminal partners spent the rest of their natural lives in a federal penitentiary, I had to build a trap they could not simply talk their way out of. A simple local bank transfer dispute could be endlessly delayed by expensive defense attorneys, claiming it was all a tragic family misunderstanding. I needed them to commit a crime so massive and so undeniable that it would immediately trigger mandatory federal sentencing guidelines. I needed them to commit irrevocable international wire fraud. On Tuesday morning, I drove to a secure, unmarked office building on the industrial side of the city. Bill, my private investigator, had arranged a highly classified meeting with a forensic accountant named Arthur. Arthur was a former Treasury Department agent who now specialized in building complex financial sting operations for private intelligence firms. When I walked into the windowless conference room, Arthur was already sitting behind a bank of glowing computer monitors. He was a quiet, meticulous man who spoke entirely in numbers and probabilities. I sat down at the heavy metal table and laid out the entire situation. I explained the forged medical documents, the hidden cameras in my house, and the recording of Trent and Harrison actively planning my murder. Arthur did not show a single ounce of surprise or emotion. He simply adjusted his glasses and told me he had seen this exact same predatory scheme play out a dozen times before. Professional grifters target wealthy, isolated, older individuals because the legal system is inherently designed to protect the young and dismiss the elderly. But Arthur told me he had never seen a victim actively choose to bait the trap with his own life on the line. Arthur spent the next 5 hours building the ultimate digital honeypot. He created a fully operational dummy financial account hosted on a secure federal server that perfectly mirrored a legitimate Cayman Islands private banking portal. The account interface was flawless. It had the correct international routing codes, the authentic encryption certificates, and the official offshore banking logos. But the entire portal was directly wired into the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. To make the trap completely irresistible, Arthur initiated a temporary federal transfer of exactly $2.4 million in seized asset funds into the dummy account. He told me that professional grifters like Trent always verify the funds before they make their move. If Trent logged into the portal, he would see $2.4 million of actual verifiable liquid cash sitting right there waiting to be taken. Arthur explained the absolute finality of the trap. He said the moment Harrison used his forged power of attorney to authorize a wire transfer out of that specific offshore account, he would immediately cross international banking jurisdictions. That single mouse click would constitute a Class A federal felony. There would be no civil lawsuits. There would be no lengthy family court battles. The federal banking system would immediately flag the transaction, and the Bureau would have absolute jurisdiction to arrest everyone involved. Wednesday morning arrived with a cold, heavy rain beating against my kitchen windows. The timeline was closing in fast. Trent had explicitly promised to trigger my fatal heart attack on Friday night. I had to get them to commit the massive wire fraud before then. I sat down at my kitchen table and stared at my cell phone resting on the cold granite counter. This was going to be the most difficult and agonizing acting performance of my entire life. I had to call the son, who was actively orchestrating my murder, and beg him for his help. I had to play the pathetic, broken victim to a boy I had loved and protected for over 30 years. I closed my eyes and dug deep into the darkest, most painful parts of my soul. I let the genuine heartbreak of losing my only child wash over me. I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent working double shifts at the freight yards just to pay for his college tuition. I thought about the $80,000 I had handed over for his fake wedding. I let the tears fall freely down my cheeks. When my voice was thick and trembling with real raw emotion, I picked up the phone and dialed Harrison's number. He answered on the second ring. His voice was bright, cheerful, and sickeningly polite. He called me Dad and asked how I was feeling this morning. I did not say hello. I just started crying directly into the receiver. I let out a loud, pathetic, gasping sob. I told Harrison I was absolutely terrified. I told him my mind was slipping away much faster than I could comprehend. I lied and said I had woken up in the middle of the night, standing in the dark kitchen, and I could not even remember my own middle name. I begged him to please come over to the house and help me. I told him there was a massive secret I had been hiding from everyone, and I was terrified I was going to lose it all if my brain completely failed today. Harrison immediately dropped his cheerful act. He adopted a tone of deep, serious, manufactured concern. He asked me what I was hiding. I told him about the offshore account. I told him his mother and I had moved $2.4 million into a secure Cayman Islands bond fund decades ago, and I had never put it into the primary family estate trust. I sobbed loudly into the phone and told him my memory was failing so badly I could barely remember the security passwords anymore. I pleaded with him to take the routing numbers and transfer the money into his own private accounts before the state doctors declared me incompetent and seized everything I owned. The silence on the other end of the phone was absolute and heavy. I could practically hear the intense greed vibrating through the cellular connection. Harrison finally spoke. His voice was completely steady and cold. He told me to stay exactly where I was and not to touch a single document. He said he was driving over right now to take care of everything. He told me I was a good father and he loved me. Hearing him say those words, knowing he fully intended to stop my heart in 2 days, made me want to violently empty my stomach. I simply thanked him in a weak voice and hung up the phone. An hour later, Harrison arrived at my house. He was not alone. Trent was right behind him. They walked into my kitchen looking like a pair of starving wolves who had just cornered a wounded deer. I played my part flawlessly. I sat at the kitchen table physically shaking, clutching a piece of heavy premium paper with the dummy account routing numbers written on it. I looked up at them with wide, terrified eyes. I handed the paper directly to Harrison. I begged him to please secure the money for our family legacy. Harrison looked at the numbers, and a massive grin spread across his face. But Trent suddenly stepped forward and violently snatched the paper out of Harrison's hand. The professional grifter was deeply paranoid. He had not survived in the criminal underworld this long by blindly trusting a terrified old man. Trent looked at me with cold, calculating, dead eyes. He asked me aggressively why I had never mentioned this massive fortune before. He demanded to know why I had let Harrison take out loans for the wedding if I had $2 million sitting in the Caribbean. I kept my head down and my shoulders slumped. I made my voice shake. I told him I was just a paranoid old man who did not trust the local banks. I said his mother made me swear to never touch the emergency money unless it was a matter of life or death. I played the confused hoarding miser perfectly. Trent did not look convinced. He grabbed Harrison by the arm and physically pulled him out of the kitchen and into the main hallway. I had anticipated this exact scenario. Yesterday, Bill had planted a microscopic hidden microphone directly inside the hallway thermostat cover. I kept my head down on the kitchen table while I listened intently through the tiny wireless earpiece hidden deep inside my left ear. I heard Trent whispering fiercely. He told Harrison that $2 million appearing out of thin air was simply too good to be true. He said the timing felt completely wrong. He told Harrison they were absolutely not going to wire the entire massive amount today. My heart began to hammer violently against my ribs. Trent insisted they execute a blind test transfer first. He explained that large offshore accounts often have automated security tripwires that freeze the funds if a massive withdrawal is requested suddenly. He said they would wire exactly $10,000 into one of his secure burner accounts this afternoon. Trent stated clearly that if the $10,000 cleared without triggering any fraud alerts or federal bank freezes, then he would feel safe enough to wire the remaining $2 million tomorrow morning. A wave of pure cold panic washed over me. A test transfer was the absolute worst-case scenario I could have possibly imagined. If Trent initiated a $10,000 wire, the federal dummy account was specifically programmed to immediately freeze the funds and alert the local authorities. The FBI would automatically swoop in and arrest them for a minor wire fraud charge. Harrison and Trent would be taken to the station, but they would easily post bail within hours. they would instantly realize the $2 million was a complete setup. The grand trap would be entirely ruined. They would vanish into the wind, and I would be left completely exposed to the violent retaliation of the sports gambling syndicate. I listened as Harrison agreed to the test transfer. They walked back into the kitchen, smiling warmly at me. Harrison patted my shoulder and told me they were going to head to the bank to start the paperwork. He promised me everything was going to be perfectly fine. They walked out the front door and drove away, leaving me alone in the silent kitchen. I had absolutely no time to waste. As soon as their car turned the corner, I grabbed my truck keys and drove frantically toward the downtown federal building. I needed to manually override a strict federal security protocol, and I only had a few hours before Trent sat down at his computer and initiated that $10,000 test transfer. The drive downtown was a blur of heavy traffic and rising panic. I parked illegally in a loading zone and practically ran through the heavy glass doors of the federal building. I flashed the temporary security badge Bill had given me and rode the elevator up to the secure financial crimes floor. I burst into the unmarked office of Special Agent Miller. Miller was the lead federal investigator assigned to monitor our specific honeypot account. He was a stern, humorless man who strictly followed bureau regulations. We sat down in a sterile, windowless interrogation room. I rapidly explained the situation to him. I told him Trent was highly paranoid and was going to test the electronic fence before he jumped over it. I begged Agent Miller to temporarily disable the automatic fraud alerts on the dummy account. I needed him to let the $10,000 test wire go through completely undetected. I needed Trent to believe he had successfully stolen the money so he would come back for the massive prize tomorrow. Agent Miller looked at me like I had completely lost my mind. He crossed his arms over his chest and flatly refused. He told me that deliberately allowing criminal suspects to successfully steal $10,000 of federal bait funds was entirely against strict bureau regulations. He said if he manually lifted the security protocols and the money disappeared, he would be risking his own federal career and his pension. I did not back down. I slammed both of my hands down onto the cold metal table. I leaned across the surface and looked the federal agent dead in his eyes. The polite, fading old man was completely gone. I was the furious logistics director fighting for my own survival. I reminded Miller that we were not just trying to catch a petty street thief. We were trying to completely dismantle a professional interstate grifting ring and a highly violent illegal sports gambling syndicate at the exact same time. I told him that if he did not let that test transfer clear smoothly, Trent would instantly spook. He would realize he was walking into a federal trap, and if Trent realized the money was fake, my own son was going to murder me in my bed by Friday night. I told Miller I was not asking for a favor. I was telling him how to save my life. Agent Miller stared at me for a long, heavy minute. The silence in the interrogation room was suffocating. Finally, he sighed heavily, picked up his secure desk phone, and made a direct call to his division chief. I sat there listening to Miller argue back and forth with his superior for 10 agonizing minutes. He explained the psychological profile of the targets. He explained the imminent threat to my physical safety. Finally, Miller set the phone down on the receiver. He looked at me with a grim, exhausted expression. He told me his division chief had agreed to authorize a highly unusual temporary 24-hour bypass on the dummy account security protocols. The $10,000 test transfer would be allowed to clear smoothly and quietly into Trent's burner account. No alarms would sound. No federal agents would be dispatched. Trent would look at his bank screen and feel completely safe and victorious. I let out a massive sigh of relief and thanked him. But Agent Miller held up his hand. He leaned forward across the metal table and delivered a chilling, terrifying warning. He told me that the trap was now completely armed and incredibly dangerous. He confirmed that the moment Harrison and Trent authorized the final $2 million wire tomorrow afternoon, the FBI tactical teams would immediately move in and make the arrests. He said they would have the entire block completely surrounded. However, Miller warned me there was a massive blind spot in our plan for tonight. He said professional grifters like Trent possess an almost supernatural instinct for danger. If Trent noticed even a single tiny anomaly during the test transfer today, if the website loaded too slowly, if the routing numbers looked slightly off, he might panic. He might instantly realize the walls were closing in around him. And Miller told me that when professional criminals panic, they do not simply pack their bags and run away. They violently tie up their loose ends. Agent Miller looked at me with absolute dead serious intensity. He told me that if they get spooked and decide to come to my house tonight under the cover of darkness, the FBI cannot protect me in time. He said they absolutely do not have the manpower or the legal authorization to place a tactical SWAT unit inside my living room based on a hypothetical threat. Miller told me I would be completely alone in the dark, with desperate, violent men who had already agreed to end my life. I walked out of the federal building and back to my truck. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the city streets. I drove back to my empty house knowing I had to survive one final terrifying night before the trap finally snapped shut. I woke up on Thursday morning feeling a strange sense of absolute calm settling over my mind. The blind terror of the previous night had completely evaporated into the cold morning air. I was no longer a frightened old man hiding in the dark, waiting for the end to come. I was a senior logistics director managing the final delivery of a very important and highly dangerous shipment. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had given me a strict and inflexible timeline to follow. The massive $2 million wire transfer was scheduled to clear at exactly 7 in the evening on Friday. I needed Harrison and his criminal friends to be completely distracted when that money officially hit their shadow accounts. I could not risk them sitting safely in their own home in front of a computer screen. If they were at home, they could immediately move the federal funds to an untraceable offshore location the second the transfer cleared. I needed them physically trapped in a single room away from their keyboards and entirely surrounded by federal agents. I picked up my phone and called my son. I made sure my voice sounded incredibly weak, confused, and deeply sentimental. Harrison answered the phone immediately with his usual fake cheerfulness. I told him I had spent the entire night awake just thinking about my long life and my family legacy. I told him I finally realized my brain was fading much faster than I wanted to admit. I said I did not want to leave this world with messy paperwork and unresolved family business weighing down on his shoulders. I told him I wanted to officially hand over the keys to the family estate. I told him I wanted to do it publicly and formally in front of the people who mattered most to our family history. I invited him, Chloe, and Trent to a private dinner on Friday night at the local Oakwood Country Club. I specifically chose the country club because that was exactly where Harrison had originally begged to host his fake, lavish wedding reception. It felt like poetic justice to end his charade in the exact place he had tried to exploit my wealth. I told Harrison I had rented the grand dining room specifically for this special occasion. I said I was going to present him with the physical trust documents and officially pass the torch of our family wealth directly into his hands. Harrison sounded absolutely ecstatic on the phone. He told me it was a brilliant idea and that he was incredibly proud of me for finally accepting reality. He promised me they would all be there dressed in their absolute best formal wear. He said it was going to be a beautiful evening of family bonding and closure. He told me he loved me and could not wait to celebrate together. I thanked him in a broken, pathetic voice and hung up the receiver. My son had absolutely no idea he was eagerly accepting a formal invitation to his own destruction. He truly thought he had won the ultimate prize, but he was simply walking blindly into a steel federal cage. With the primary targets successfully locked into the venue, I began to systematically assemble the audience. A public execution requires credible witnesses to ensure the true story is never twisted or denied later. I did not just want Harrison and Trent to go to federal prison quietly in the middle of the night. I wanted their entire fabricated reality to burn to the ground in front of the specific community they had actively tried to deceive. My first phone call was to David Vance. David was the bank manager who had looked at me with such profound pity when Harrison presented the forged medical documents on Monday morning. I called David and formally asked him to attend the legacy dinner. I told him I was officially transferring my entire estate to my son, and I needed my most trusted financial advisor there to witness the legal transition. David agreed immediately. He said he was incredibly relieved I was finally accepting my medical reality and making peace with my son before things got worse. He told me he would be honored to attend and support our family during this transition. My next stop was the local notary public. Her name was Brenda. Brenda was the woman whose official state stamp had been expertly forged on the fake power of attorney document hidden inside my floor safe. I drove across town, walked into her small office, and personally invited her to the country club. I told her I was finalizing some major estate paperwork and wanted her there to celebrate the milestone. Brenda was a sweet older woman who had notarized my late wife's will many years ago. She smiled warmly and told me she would not miss it for the world. Finally, I called the senior elders of my community church. These were the men and women who had stood by my side and held my hands when I buried Sarah. These were the exact people Harrison had actively lied to when he brought his fake bride to our Sunday services and pretended to be a devoted Christian son. I invited the head pastor and 3 senior elders to the dinner. I told them I was making peace with my failing mind and giving my family the greatest financial gift I could possibly offer before I lost my memory completely. They promised to be there to support me through this difficult emotional transition. The guest list was now perfectly calculated and locked into place. I was deliberately surrounding my son with the exact people he had used to build his fraudulent empire. When the absolute truth was finally revealed, they were all going to watch him fall, and nobody in this town would ever believe his lies again. I drove to the Oakwood Country Club on Thursday afternoon to finalize the physical logistics of the trap. The club manager knew me well and had prepared their finest private dining room at the end of a long, isolated hallway. The room featured a massive, polished mahogany table, a beautiful hanging crystal chandelier, and heavy, dark velvet curtains that blocked out the windows. But more importantly, the room featured a massive, retractable digital projector screen mounted directly into the ceiling. I spent 2 solid hours working alone with the audio-visual technician. I loaded a secure encrypted file containing all the digital evidence onto the country club computer system. I tested the handheld remote control thoroughly, walking to every corner of the room to ensure there would be no technical failures or dead zones. I pressed a small black button on the plastic remote, and the massive projector screen instantly dropped from the ceiling, flooding the dark room with a bright, crisp, high-definition image. I pressed the button again, and the screen quietly retracted back into the ceiling out of sight. The electronic system was completely flawless. While I was testing the electronics, Agent Miller arrived at the country club through the rear kitchen delivery entrance. He was accompanied by 6 highly trained undercover federal agents. They were not wearing tactical gear or heavy bureau windbreakers. They were dressed in crisp white button-down shirts, black vests, and black slacks. They looked exactly like high-end catering waitstaff hired for a wealthy private event. Agent Miller walked through the dining room, mapping out the specific exit routes and the visual sightlines. He instructed his team to lock down the perimeter. He told me his tactical team would be stationed at every single door, preventing anyone from leaving the room once the trap was sprung. He said they would be pouring expensive wine and serving hot appetizers while they waited for the massive wire transfer to trigger the federal alarm system. We discussed the specific seating arrangements. I placed Harrison's chair directly across from the projector screen, so he would be forced to look straight at his own crimes. I placed Trent's chair near the back wall furthest away from the main exit doors to eliminate any chance of a physical escape. Miller handed me a tiny flesh-colored wireless earpiece. He told me to keep it completely hidden deep inside my ear canal at all times. He said he would be actively monitoring the dummy bank account from a mobile command center parked in a disguised delivery van outside the kitchen. He promised me he would give me the immediate verbal signal, the absolute exact second the $2 million officially cleared international waters and entered the federal trap. Friday evening finally arrived. The heavy rainstorm had cleared, leaving a cold, crisp twilight over the quiet city. My house was completely silent. I walked into my master bedroom and stood directly in front of the large, full-length mirror. For the past entire week, I had deliberately worn baggy, stained clothing to project extreme physical weakness. I had slouched my shoulders and shuffled my feet across the floor to sell the illusion. I had played the role of a pathetic, broken victim waiting for a nursing home. That pathetic performance was officially over. I reached into the very back of my dark closet and pulled out a finest tailored charcoal gray suit. It was the exact same suit I had worn to my corporate retirement dinner 5 years ago. I put on a crisp white shirt and a dark silk tie. I polished my black leather shoes until they shined like glass under the bedroom lights. I opened my jewelry box and took out the silver cufflinks Sarah had given me for our 20th anniversary. I fastened them to my sleeves, feeling like a knight putting on his armor for the final battle. I stood up perfectly straight. I pushed my broad shoulders back and took a deep, powerful breath of air. The frail old man was completely gone. I looked down at the wooden bedroom dresser and picked up a small silver-framed photograph of my late wife. I stared at her beautiful, smiling face for a long time. I promised her I was going to fiercely protect the legacy we had built together over 40 long years. I promised her I was going to surgically remove the poison from our family tree tonight, no matter how much it hurt my own heart. I slipped the small black audio-visual remote control deep into my right suit pocket. I grabbed my truck keys and walked out of the house, leaving the lights off. I drove toward the country club with a heart made of solid ice. I was no longer a victim waiting to be slaughtered in my own bed by greedy predators. I was the executioner, and the trap was perfectly set. The Oakwood Country Club was a monument to old wealth and quiet secrets. I pulled my truck up to the grand entrance and handed the keys to the young valet. The evening air felt thick and charged with a heavy incoming storm. I walked up the wide stone steps and pushed through the heavy glass doors. The lobby smelled of expensive cedar wood and roasted meats. I walked past the main dining area, moving purposefully down the long corridor leading to the private reserve room. As I approached the heavy double mahogany doors, I felt the tiny wireless earpiece resting deep inside my ear canal. Agent Miller had promised me he was out there in the dark, monitoring the digital tripwires. I pushed the doors open and stepped right into the center of the trap. The private dining room looked absolutely breathtaking. A long, polished mahogany table sat in the exact center, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. Soft yellow light glowed from the massive crystal chandelier hanging above. 3 men dressed in crisp white shirts and black vests were quietly arranging crystal wine glasses and silver cutlery. They moved with an absolute silent military precision. They were not country club employees. They were undercover federal tactical agents. One of them briefly made eye contact with me and gave a microscopic nod. The perimeter was completely secure. My invited guests began to arrive exactly on time. David Vance, the bank manager, walked in wearing a sharp gray suit. He shook my hand with that same look of profound pity he had given me all week. Brenda the notary public arrived next, wearing a bright floral dress. She hugged me warmly and told me how incredibly brave I was for getting my affairs in order. Then the church elders arrived, led by Pastor Thomas. They gathered around me, placing their heavy hands on my shoulders and offering quiet prayers for my failing mind and my physical health. I thanked them all in a soft, trembling voice, playing my pathetic part perfectly. Then the heavy wooden doors swung open one final time. Harrison walked into the room holding Chloe's hand. Trent walked closely behind them. They were dressed like absolute royalty. Harrison wore a tailored black tuxedo that fit him flawlessly. Chloe wore a stunning dark green evening gown. Trent was wearing a sharp navy suit, looking every bit the successful independent real estate developer he pretended to be. When Harrison saw the bank manager and the church elders, a brief flash of surprise crossed his face, but he quickly masked it with a bright, warm smile. He walked straight toward me and wrapped his arms around my shoulders in a tight embrace. He whispered in my ear that he was so incredibly proud of me. The sheer audacity of his affection made my skin violently crawl, but I patted his back and smiled blindly at my guests. We all took our assigned seats around the massive table. I sat at the absolute head of the table. Harrison sat directly to my right, and Chloe sat next to him. Trent took his seat near the far end, precisely where I had placed his name card. He was completely boxed in by the church elders and physically blocked from the only exit door by the undercover federal agents pouring the ice water. The dinner service began. The undercover agents brought out plates of prime rib and roasted asparagus. The room was filled with the sounds of clinking silverware and polite, quiet conversation. I could not eat a single bite. The food felt like dry sawdust in my mouth. I kept my eyes focused on the people around me. I watched David Vance talking politely to Brenda about the local real estate market. I watched Pastor Thomas asking Chloe about her childhood in Nevada. Chloe lied flawlessly, telling the pastor about a fictional wealthy upbringing. But mostly, I watched Harrison and Trent. They were putting on a masterful performance for the guests, but I could see the underlying nervous energy radiating off their bodies. They were both constantly checking the time. Trent kept his cell phone resting face up on the table right next to his water glass. Harrison kept shifting his weight in his leather chair. The federal dummy account was programmed to release the $2 million at exactly 7 o'clock. It was currently 6:45. We had exactly 15 minutes left until the absolute point of no return. At 10 minutes to 7, Harrison decided it was time to play the loving son for the audience. He picked up his crystal wine glass and gently tapped it with his silver butter knife. The sharp ringing sound immediately silenced the room. Everyone stopped eating and looked toward him. Harrison stood up slowly, buttoned his tuxedo jacket, and looked down at me with an expression of pure manufactured devotion. Harrison began his toast. He thanked everyone for coming together on such short notice. He told the bank manager and the church elders that this was a deeply emotional night for our family. He spoke about his late mother, Sarah, and how much she would have loved to see everyone gathered in this beautiful room. He looked at me and his eyes actually welled up with completely fake tears. He called me his hero. He called me his guiding light. Harrison told the room that aging is a cruel and difficult process. He said it takes immense courage for a strong, independent man to admit when his mind is finally starting to slip away. He praised me for my bravery. He told the audience that I was generously handing over the keys to the family legacy tonight so that he could protect me and care for me in my final fading years. He raised his glass high in the air and proposed a toast to his aging, generous father. He said I was a man who had built a foundation of absolute truth and love. The church elders murmured in agreement and raised their glasses. David Vance wiped a small tear from his eye. Brenda the notary smiled warmly. They all drank to my honor. Trent and Chloe drank their wine, hiding their vicious, predatory smirks behind the crystal rims. I sat in my chair, gripping the armrests so tightly my fingers went entirely numb. I listened to my son use the memory of my dead wife to sell his horrific lies to my closest friends. I listened to him praise my courage while secretly knowing he planned to slip a lethal dose of digitalis into my coffee tomorrow night. The absolute evil of his performance burned through my veins like liquid fire. I looked up at the large grandfather clock standing in the corner of the dining room. The brass hands read exactly 6:55. 5 minutes left. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up. The room grew completely silent again. I looked at the faces of the people I had known for 5 years. I looked at the undercover federal agents standing quietly near the walls. And finally, I looked directly at my son. I kept my posture completely straight. I did not slouch. I did not let my hands shake. I let my voice drop into the deep, resonant, commanding tone I used to negotiate multi-million-dollar freight contracts. I thanked Harrison for his beautiful words. I told the room that my son was absolutely right about one thing. I had spent 40 years of my life studying the strict concepts of foundations and supply chains. I told them that a logistics director knows every single item in his warehouse. He knows every route, every truck, and every single point of failure. I said that when you build a massive, complex structure, it does not matter how beautiful the building looks from the outside. If the foundation is built on lies, the entire building will inevitably violently collapse. Harrison frowned slightly. He looked confused by my sudden change in tone. He expected me to cry and hand him a leather folder full of legal documents. He did not expect a strict lecture on corporate infrastructure. I continued speaking slowly, pacing my words to the ticking of the clock. I told the room that over the past week, I had taken a very careful inventory of my own life. I said I had looked closely at the people standing inside my warehouse. I told them I had audited my family. I looked directly at Chloe. I said that sometimes people come into our lives claiming to be sweet, innocent additions to our family tree. But an audit requires you to verify their actual origins. Chloe shifted uncomfortably in her chair. The sweet smile on her face began to freeze. I turned my gaze to Trent. I said that sometimes people claim to be protective brothers simply looking out for their sister. But when you inspect the cargo closely, you realize they are nothing but professional thieves waiting for the lights to go out. Trent completely stopped chewing his food. He stared at me with cold, calculating eyes. His hand slowly reached out and rested flat on the mahogany table right next to his cell phone. Finally, I looked at Harrison. I told my son that the most painful audit of all is the one you conduct on your own flesh and blood. I said, it is a terrible, agonizing thing to realize that the boy you raised has intentionally invited wolves into his own home. It is a terrifying thing to realize your son is willing to burn his own father alive just to pay off a gambling debt. The dining room descended into a state of absolute shocked paralysis. Pastor Thomas dropped his cloth napkin onto his plate. Brenda let out a small, confused gasp. David Vance looked back and forth between me and Harrison, his face pale with sudden confusion. Harrison stood up abruptly. His chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. He let out a nervous, shaky laugh and looked around the room at the guests. He held his hands up in a placating gesture. He told everyone to please stay calm. He said his father was simply having a severe dementia episode. He stepped toward me, reaching his hands out to grab my shoulders. He told me to sit down and promised he was going to take me to the hospital right now. I took a step back and raised my hand, pointing my finger directly at his chest. I told him not to take another single step toward me. My voice echoed off the wood-paneled walls with absolute commanding authority. The grandfather clock in the corner began to chime. It was exactly 7 o'clock. At that exact precise second, The silence in the room was shattered by a sharp electronic buzzing sound. It was Harrison's cell phone vibrating violently inside his tuxedo jacket pocket. A fraction of a second later, Trent's cell phone lit up and vibrated loudly against the mahogany table. Trent looked down at his bright screen. I could see the reflection of the light in his eyes. The federal dummy account had just automatically processed the $2 million offshore wire transfer. The money had officially landed in their shadow accounts. The irrevocable federal crime of international wire fraud had just been fully and completely committed. Deep inside my ear canal, the tiny wireless earpiece crackled to life. Agent Miller's voice spoke directly into my ear. He said, "The wire is complete. We have them. Execute the reveal." I reached my right hand deep into my suit pocket. I wrapped my fingers around the small plastic audio-visual remote control. I looked Harrison dead in the eyes, and I pressed the button. Above our heads, the ceiling panels smoothly slid open. A massive motorized projector screen dropped down with a low mechanical hum unfurling directly behind me. At the same time, the heavy velvet curtains covering the windows automatically pulled shut, plunging the room into darkness. A powerful beam of bright white light shot from the projector mounted on the ceiling, illuminating the massive screen for everyone to see. Harrison spun around and stared at the screen. The church elders gasped loudly. It was not a slideshow of happy family memories. The very first image projected onto the massive screen was the raw, high-definition photograph Jess had taken at the rehearsal dinner. The image was absolutely massive, towering 10 feet tall. Every single detail was painfully crisp and clear. It showed the dark hallway of my house. It showed Chloe standing guard in her white dress. And in the center of the screen, illuminated by a digital exposure boost, it showed Trent kneeling on my office floor, actively picking the lock on my steel floor safe. The silence in the room was completely shattered. Pastor Thomas stood up from his chair, knocking his water glass over in absolute horror. Before anyone could say a single word, I pressed the button on the remote again. The image instantly changed. The next slide was a massive blown-up scan of the forged power of attorney document. The text was huge and undeniable. I pointed to the bottom of the screen. I called out to the notary public. I asked Brenda if that was her official blue state stamp on the document. I asked her if she had ever authorized that medical power of attorney. Brenda stood up, her hands covering her mouth in absolute shock. She stared at the massive projection. She shook her head violently and screamed that she had absolutely nothing to do with that document. She yelled that someone had stolen her signature and forged her state credentials. David Vance, the bank manager, jumped out of his chair. He pointed at Harrison and shouted that Harrison had presented that exact forged document to the bank branch just 3 days ago. David yelled that Harrison had used it to try and steal $350,000. I pressed the remote button a third time. The final slide flashed onto the screen. It was the certified legal marriage certificate from Clark County, Nevada. It displayed the names Chloe and Trent in bold black ink. I spoke over the rising chaos in the room. I told the church elders that the beautiful young woman sitting at the table was not my son's wife. I told them she was legally married to the criminal sitting at the end of the table. I exposed them completely. I told the room they were professional grifters hired by my own son to drain my life savings before the illegal sports syndicate broke his legs. The room completely exploded into absolute panic and righteous fury. The church elders began shouting at Harrison. Brenda was crying and demanding the police be called immediately. Harrison turned completely pale. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. His perfect fake world had just violently shattered into a million unfixable pieces. He lunged across the space between us, his hands reaching out to grab my throat. He screamed at the top of his lungs that I was completely insane. He yelled that the photos were fake and that his mind was perfectly fine. He was completely unhinged, violently desperate to silence the truth. But he never reached me. Down at the far end of the long table, Trent had realized exactly what was happening. The professional criminal recognized the absolute finality of the trap. He looked at the massive projector screen, then looked at the furious faces of the bank manager and the church elders. He did not try to argue. He did not try to defend his fake sister. Trent simply pushed his heavy leather chair backward, kicked it out of his way, and sprinted full speed toward the side exit door of the dining room. He was trying to abandon his wife and my son to save himself. Trent kicked his heavy leather chair backwards so violently, it crashed into the dark wood paneling of the dining room wall. He spun around and sprinted toward the side exit door, his eyes wide with absolute panic. He was fast, but he was running blindly into a concrete wall of federal authority. The three men dressed as country club waitstaff did not even flinch. They dropped their white linen serving napkins to the floor. They reached beneath their crisp black vests, and in perfect, terrifying unison, they drew their federal badges and heavy, dark firearms. Agent Miller stepped out from the kitchen corridor, completely blocking the only remaining exit. His voice boomed through the room with absolute command, ordering Trent to drop to the ground. Trent hesitated for a fraction of a second, weighing his desperate options. That tiny hesitation was his final mistake. Two undercover agents lunged forward, closing the distance in an instant. They tackled Trent to the hardwood floor with a violent bone-rattling crash that shook the massive mahogany table. I heard the sharp, heavy metallic click of steel handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists. The professional grifter who had confidently picked my safe and plotted my murder was now pinned to the ground, breathless, humiliated, and completely defeated. Chloe saw her husband hit the floor, and her entire facade violently shattered. The sweet, innocent bride act vanished into thin air. She began screaming hysterically, her voice echoing shrilly off the crystal chandelier. She backed away from the table, knocking over expensive wine glasses that shattered across the floor in pools of dark red liquid. An agent grabbed her arms firmly, pulled them behind her back, and secured her wrists with cold steel. She kicked and thrashed her designer evening gown twisting around her legs. She screamed vicious obscenities at the federal officers, cursing them and cursing me. The church elders watched in absolute stunned silence as the beautiful, polite young woman they had welcomed into their congregation morphed into a feral, trapped animal right before their eyes. Then there was Harrison, my only son. The boy I had protected and provided for my entire life. He did not run. He knew there was absolutely nowhere left to hide. He watched the federal agents completely dismantle his fake family and lock them in chains. Then he slowly turned his head to look at me. All the arrogant confidence completely drained from his body. His legs gave out beneath him. He collapsed onto his knees right there on the expensive country club rug directly in front of my chair. He looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. Tears were streaming heavily down his pale face. They were not the fake manufactured tears he had used during his toast. They were the raw, ugly tears of a man who suddenly realized his entire life was completely over. He began to beg. He pleaded with me to stop the agents from taking him away. He cried out that I did not understand the immense pressure he was under. He blamed the illegal sports gambling syndicate for everything. He cried that the violent bookies were going to kill him if he did not pay the massive debt. He reached out with trembling hands and grabbed the hem of my tailored suit jacket. He sobbed loudly, claiming he never actually wanted to hurt me. He swore he was just scared and desperate and did not know how to escape the hole he had dug for himself. He begged me to tell the federal agents it was all a big misunderstanding. He called me Dad over and over again, hoping to spark some lingering paternal instinct. I stood there looking down at the broken man kneeling at my feet. I searched my heart for even a single drop of pity or forgiveness. I looked deep into my own soul, trying to find the father who used to carry this boy on his shoulders. But I found absolutely nothing. The pure, unconditional love I had for him had died the exact moment I heard him agree to poison my evening coffee. The man crying on the floor was not my son. He was a greedy, desperate stranger who had tried to bury me alive. I reached down and gently pulled my suit jacket out of his desperate, frantic grip. I stood perfectly straight and looked him dead in his weeping eyes. The entire dining room was completely silent, except for Chloe's distant sobbing and the heavy breathing of the federal agents. I spoke in a voice so cold and calm, it surprised even myself. I told him I paid $80,000 for a wedding, but this divorce, this one is on me. Harrison let out a pathetic, agonizing wail as two massive agents stepped forward. They lifted him off his knees, pulling his arms roughly behind his back. Agent Miller walked to the center of the room and loudly read them their federal rights. The words hung in the air, heavy with absolute finality. Harrison, Chloe, and Trent were marched out the back doors of the country club in absolute disgrace. They were loaded into heavy black armored vehicles waiting in the rain-slicked alley. The flashing red and blue police lights illuminated the dark street, washing over their faces as the heavy steel doors slammed shut. I turned back to the dining table. Pastor Thomas David Vance, the bank manager, and Brenda, the notary public, were all sitting in absolute, profound shock. They had just witnessed a level of betrayal they could barely comprehend. I took a deep breath, smoothing my tie. I apologized to them for the terrible, dramatic scene. I thanked them sincerely for coming and bearing witness to the absolute truth. I told them that the rotting poison had finally been surgically removed from my home and my family tree. Pastor Thomas stood up, walked over to me, and wrapped me in a tight embrace. He told me I was a good, righteous man who had survived a terrible evil. The legal fallout over the next several months was incredibly swift and completely merciless, because they had actively authorized a massive wire transfers from an offshore dummy account, monitored directly by the federal government. They immediately triggered mandatory federal sentencing guidelines. There were no expensive, drawn-out civil trials. There were no lengthy family court delays or backroom plea deals. The mountain of evidence Bill and I had gathered was absolute and completely crushing. The hidden home video recordings, the forged medical documents, the fake Nevada marriage certificates, and the undeniable federal wire fraud data painted a perfect, inescapable picture of their guilt. During the trial, Trent and Chloe desperately attempted to turn on Harrison. They tried to blame him for orchestrating the entire operation, hoping to reduce their own sentences. But the federal prosecutors did not care about their pointing fingers. The judge saw them for exactly what they were. The husband and wife grifter team were both sentenced to 15 hard years in federal prison for criminal conspiracy, international wire fraud, and aggravated elder abuse. They lost everything they had stolen over the years and were locked away in separate maximum security facilities. My son Harrison stood before the stern federal judge in his orange jumpsuit and wept openly in the courtroom. He tried to claim he was a helpless victim of the violent gambling syndicate. He tried to argue he was acting under extreme duress, but the prosecuting attorney simply played the audio recording of Harrison calmly agreeing to slip a fatal dose of digitalis into my coffee for $2 million. The judge looked at Harrison with absolute disgust. The judge showed zero mercy. Harrison was sentenced to 10 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Furthermore, the violent sports syndicate he was so terrified of was completely raided and dismantled by the Bureau a few weeks later, based entirely on the financial trails Bill had uncovered during his private investigation. As for my wealth and my life savings, they remained completely untouched. The forged medical power of Attorney Harrison had filed was entirely useless. Richard, my brilliant estate lawyer, had executed the covert springing trust perfectly. Every single penny, every stock portfolio, every physical asset, and the massive life insurance policy were locked safely away behind an impenetrable legal fortress. They had stolen absolutely nothing from me, except my illusions of a happy family. On a quiet Sunday morning after the trials were over, I drove to the cemetery. I walked across the green grass and stood before Sarah's marble headstone. I placed a fresh bouquet of her favorite yellow roses on the ground. I stood there for a long time talking to her in the quiet morning breeze. I told her the terrible storm had finally passed. I promised her I had fiercely protected the beautiful legacy we had built together over 40 long years. I told her I was safe now. I returned to my quiet suburban house. The deep silence that used to terrify me, the silence that used to remind me of my loneliness, now brings me a profound, absolute sense of peace. I wake up early in the morning. I sit at my kitchen island, and I drink my black coffee while I watch the bright sun rise over the backyard. I am completely alone in this big house, but I am absolutely free. I survived the vicious wolves that came to my front door, even when the lead wolf was my own flesh and blood. I reclaimed my life, my dignity, and my future. They looked at my gray hair, my wrinkled hands, and my tired shoulders, and they mistakenly thought my age made me weak. They thought the passing years had made me slow, frail, and easily confused. They saw a grieving widower and assumed they were looking at an easy, helpless target. They forgot that age brings patience. They forgot that a man who has spent a lifetime building a solid foundation knows exactly how to methodically dismantle one. They thought I was just an old, broken man waiting to die in a nursing home. Instead, I became the careful, calculating architect of their absolute destruction. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw blind, angry punches in the dark. I simply gathered the truth, built an inescapable cage, and let their own overwhelming greed snap the lock shut. If you see yourself in this story, please listen to me very carefully. Whether you are dealing with a greedy, ungrateful child, a manipulative relative, or a stranger trying to take advantage of your trusting kindness, you must stand up and fight back. Do not ever let them use your deep love as a weapon against you. Do not let them gaslight you into believing that your mind is failing or that your voice no longer matters in this world. You are not a burden and you are not weak. Gather your evidence in absolute silence. Do not confront them while you are still vulnerable. Speak to lawyers. Speak to private investigators. Build your financial and legal fortress brick by brick while you smile and play their game. And when the time is perfectly right, when your trap is fully armed, you strike back with everything you have. You owe it to yourself to demand respect. You owe it to the legacy you spent your entire life building. Justice is not always handed to you by the universe. Sometimes you have to roll up your sleeves and manufacture it yourself. If this story resonated with your heart, or if you know someone who desperately needs to hear this message right now, please hit the like button on this video. Please subscribe to the channel to join our growing community of strong, resilient survivors. And please take a second right now to leave a comment below telling me exactly where you are located in the world and what time it is right now as you listen to my voice. Your engagement helps push these important stories out to the people who need to hear them the most. Thank you for your valuable time, your undivided attention, and your incredible strength. Stay safe, stay highly vigilant, and never let anyone tell you that your fight is over.